Hello, welcome to Prejim Technologies. I am Venkat. This is part 79 of ASP.NET video series. In this session, we'll discuss about tracing in ASP.NET. Tracing enables us to view diagnostic information about a request, which is very useful when debugging application-related problems. In this session, we're going to concentrate on the basics of tracing, and in a later video session, we'll discuss about where tracing can actually be used. In fact, we'll discuss about an example where we will solve the root cause of a performance-related issue very easily by using tracing. Tracing can be turned on or off either at the application level or at the page level. To enable tracing at the application level, all we have to do is set the trace elements enabled attribute to true. Let's flip to Visual Studio. I have an ASP.NET Web Application project here on this webform1.aspx. I have got a grid view control, and when this webform1 loads up, we are creating an instance of the dataset object, and we are invoking the readXML method, which reads the contents of the countries.xml file into the dataset, which in turn is used as the data source for the grid view control, and finally we are invoking the databind method. So we have this countries.xml file within the project. When I run this web form, as you might expect, the data will be loaded into this web form, into this grid view control. Now I want to enable tracing for this web application, and if I want to enable tracing at the application level within web.config file, I can set the trace elements and enabled attribute to true. So trace enabled is equal to true. That's it. Now let me go ahead and run this now. So the web form data is loaded, but then on the page I don't see any trace information. So where is this trace information logged? When we enable tracing in web.config file for the entire application, the trace information is actually logged in a trace file called trace.axt. So let me copy this URL, open another tab in the browser, paste the URL there, and instead of webform1.aspx, I'm going to type in trace.axt and press enter. Look at that. I get this trace viewer file, and here look at this, it's webform1, and we made a get request. It's not a post back request. So if you look at the verb, it's get request, and the HTTP status code is 200, which means OK, and the file is webform1.aspx and the time of your request. Okay, and if you want to see the complete details of this trace, you can click on view details, and there's very useful information here which can be used for debugging purposes. In a later video session, we will see how this information can be used to solve the root cause of a performance related issue. So for example, look at this. We have request details. What's the session ID? What is the time of the request? What is the encoding for the request and response encoding? And what is the HTTP status code? 200 in this case, which means OK. And the request type is a get and not a post back request. And another interesting thing here is you can see all the page level events and the time they take to complete. Okay, and then further down we have the control tree, the entire control tree on the web form. Okay, and then further down we have information about session state, application state, any cookies that we have, that's a session cookie, and any cookies, persistent cookies that we may have written, HTTP header information, form variables collection, query strings, and HTTP server variables. Okay, so a lot of useful information on this trace page. Alright, so at the moment we have enabled tracing for all the pages within our web application. Now let's say I want to disable tracing for a specific page. For example, within this web application project, I have test.aspx page. Now let's go ahead and request test.aspx instead of webform1. So I'm going to say test.aspx. Now if I come here and refresh my trace viewer file, look at that, I also get the test page. Okay, but let's say I want to disable tracing for test page. How do I do that in spite of having it enabled at the application level? All you have to do is on the page set the trace elements to false. That's it. Okay, now let's go ahead and request this page once again. I press F5 here. Okay, I got that, and let me refresh this now. Look at that, the trace information for test page is not logged. And let me access webform1 just to make sure it's still being logged. So I have webform1.aspx. Now I come here, press F5, look at that, webform1, it's traced, But if I go back to test.aspx and I refresh this, it's not traced anymore. Okay, so to disable tracing for a specific page, set trace is equal to false in the web forms page directive, and that's what we have just done. And if tracing is enabled at the application level, the trace messages are returned to a file called trace.axt. Trace.axt file can only be accessed locally. So if you look at this now, my web server is on this machine, and I'm accessing the trace viewer file locally on that web server. Now if I try to access this trace viewer file from a remote machine, I will not be able to do that. Okay, but then is there a possibility to access this trace viewer file from a remote machine? Absolutely. For that, you have to set the local only attribute to false. By default, this attribute will be true. If you don't set that, it will be true, because trace file has got very useful information that could be, security sensitive information that could be useful to a hacker to hack into the server. So set this attribute to false only when it is required. By default, it is true, which means this trace file is only available when accessed on that web server locally. If you access that from a remote machine, it's not available. But however, we can make it available by setting this local only attribute of the trace element to false. Let's see how to do that. So within web.config file, all I have to do is set local only attribute to false. This will be true by default. You're telling not only make this available locally but also remotely. That's what this attribute means when you set it to false. To append trace messages. Now if you look at this, the trace messages are actually returned to this trace file. Now let's say instead of accumulating these trace messages, I want these trace messages actually to be returned on the page itself. At the end of the page, I want the trace messages to be displayed. Is it possible? Absolutely. All you have to do is, for this trace element, there's another attribute called page output. You can set that to true. So the moment you set that to true, you're telling write the trace information at the end of the page. So now for this test page, if you remember, we have disabled tracing. So let's request webform1. So webform1.aspx. Now look at that. The trace information is actually written to the end of the page itself. Okay. So that's how we display the trace information at the end of the page, and use request limit attribute. This request limit is very interesting. Now, how long should we capture this trace information in the trace.axt file? Let's go ahead and disable this page output. We don't want that to be on the page. Okay, now we have this trace.axt file. So let me refresh this web page. So if you look at this trace.axt file, it's actually capturing, if you press F5 so many times, I pressed like 7-8 times now. I press F5, look at that. There are these trace logs, all the requests are captured within the trace file. But how many requests are going to be logged? Is there any limit for these trace messages? Absolutely. And how do we determine that? To determine that, or to specify the limit for the trace messages to be returned to the trace log, we use an attribute called request limit. By default, its value is 10. Okay, so if you look at this one, look at this approximately. There are 10 entries here, and you can see this remaining 0, which means it will not log any trace messages going further. Now if you look at this, the last request was logged as 18:38:15:4. Now if I request this webform1, when I press F5, I've pressed it a couple of times. Let me refresh this by pressing F5. Look at that. The trace information is not captured for this webform1 in the trace viewer because the request limit has reached. The default value is 10 and it stopped tracing. Okay, now we can change that using request limit. For example, let's say I want to track only the first 5 requests. I can set that to 5. Let me save that. Let's go back here. Let's re-request this page. Let's press F5 here. Look at that. So I got one request at 18:40. Let me press F5 a couple of times. Now look at this. There are 4 remaining entries that can be logged. Now if I press F5 here, there's 1 remaining entry, and if I press F5 here, I press F5 now, So remaining is 0, which means from now on, since that request limit has reached, the trace information is not logged for any web form. Okay. So that's the request limit attribute. Use request limit attribute to control the number of trace requests that are stored on the server. The default is 10. After this limit is reached, the server will stop writing to the trace file. Okay. If you want to log trace messages even after the request limit has reached, then set most recent attribute to true. When this attribute is set to true, the old entries in the trace log are discarded and the new entries get added. But at any given point of time, only 5 entries are maintained. It keeps on discarding the old entries and keeps on adding the new entries or new requests. Okay, let's quickly look at that attribute. So I'm going to set this most recent is equal to true, and we have set the request limit to 5. So let me now save that first and come here. Okay, so I'm requesting this 1. Let's come here, request this. Okay, so that's one request. Let me press F5 1 2 3 4. So now if we refresh this, we should have 5 entries. And remember, the first request was made at 18:41:37. Now when I make another request and come here, look at what happens to this 18:41:37 when I refresh this. That goes away. Look at that, it's gone away, and I got another request at 18:41:57. Okay, so that's the use of most recent attributes. Okay, when this attribute is set to true, the old entries in the trace log are discarded and the new entries get added. On this slide, you can find resources for ASP.NET, C# and SQL Server interview questions. That's it for today. Thank you for listening. Have a great day.